I do think it's noteworthy to say Italian wine was not included on that first list, but that a lot of Italian products were. They decided to not put tariffs on Italian wine, but a whole series of other Italian products were. So theoretically, if they really wanted to, because Italy was a part of that award, so if they really wanted to, Italian wine could certainly be at risk for the Airbus issue.
Hello, welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market with me, your host, Juliana Colangelo. This show has been designed to demystify the U.S. market for Italian wineries through interviews with experts in sales and distribution, social media, communications, and so much more. We will quiz each of our esteemed guests in every episode to solidify the lessons that we've learned from the episode. So sharpen your pencils, get out your notebooks, and join us this week to learn more about the U.S. market. Hello, welcome to Masterclass U.S. Wine Market. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Ben Aneff to the Italian Wine Podcast. Ben serves as the president of the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance and is a leading advocate against wine tariffs. As the managing partner of Tribeca Wine Merchants in New York City, Ben has long been at the forefront of the fight against tariffs. Before the formation of USWTA, he spearheaded efforts that resulted in over 28,000 letters to Congress through collaboration with the National Association of Wine Retailers and other industry groups. Ben has also testified at the International Trade Commission on the detrimental effects of tariffs on wine and continues to lead discussions and lobbying efforts to protect U.S. wine businesses. We're very excited to have Ben on the podcast today as we prepare ourselves for the next year and the next presidential administration in the U.S. So Ben, welcome to the show. It's really great to have you here.
Well, thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
So Ben, for starters, before we dive into everything tariffs related, tell us just a little bit briefly about your background and your intro into the wine industry and specifically how you came to hold this role today with U.S. Wine Trade Alliance.
Sure. Well, I was lucky enough to join the wine industry through Tribeca Wine Merchants. I had finished graduate school and was in the music world waiting on auditions and wanted to get started in the wine business sort of part-time and fell in love with it the way probably many people that are listening to this podcast fell in love with it. And I was lucky enough to figure out I was in a special place, ironically, because I had a question about wines of Piedmont. And I remember speaking to one of the founders of Tribeca Wine Merchants and saying, gosh, I really don't feel like I understand Piedmont well at all. I haven't tasted very many of the wines. It's difficult to come around great examples of older wines. And I'd just love, an opportunity at some point to get to know them better. And he said, it's funny. This week, there's going to be a great dinner in the private room of 11 Madison. And back then, remember, 11 Madison was not the 3 Michelin star restaurant that it is today. It was, I think Danny Meyer had sort of wanted to think about it as the greatest neighborhood restaurant, something along those lines. They did these amazing wine dinners with producers. And I was lucky enough to go to a dinner with Roberto Conterno and some great winemakers and great wine collectors. And it was an early experience for me that was very formative. And I realized just how special a place New York City was because of the access both to really passionate consumers who have, great examples of these wines, as well as, it's a place where the great producers from all over the world come. It was a fun time and really led to kind of rethink what I was doing and say, gosh, this wine thing's pretty special.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What a great story. I wish the EMP was still that neighborhood spot with wine dinners. That sounds like the good old days for sure.
It was the good old days.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Ben, again, we're very excited that you're taking some time to talk to us today about the tariffs, as I think myself included, we're all very curious and a bit anxious about what comes next. So for today's episode, we're going to talk more specifically about how the tariffs will impact Italian wine. And our 3 key takeaways for this episode are, number 1, how will tariffs affect every level of the 3-tier wine industry in the United States? Number 2, how will tariffs impact Italian wineries selling wine in the U.S.? And then finally, what's next and how do we prepare for what lies ahead in 2025? So for starters, let's just set the scene and lay some background. What is the current situation with tariffs that looms ahead of us as a result of the recent presidential election?
Sure. So where we sort of left off, the previous round of tariffs were as a response to the illegal subsidies to Airbus. It's part of a World Trade Organization award to the United States that allowed the U.S. to put tariffs on exported goods from a specific list of countries that were involved in subsidies to Airbus. From the wine side, Italy is actually not a part of the initial tariff round. These were the 25% tariffs on most still wine, up to 14% alcohol from France, Spain, Germany, and the United Kingdom. It was later expanded to include a few other formats because initially it was just 750 milliliter bottles. Those tariffs were paused, and they're paused through summer of 2026, and the list was expunged. So theoretically, if those tariffs do come back, they would need to go back through the process of coming up with a list again. So they wouldn't necessarily snap back.
Okay, that's really good to know.
An interesting piece there is, I do think it's noteworthy to say Italian wine was not included on that first list, but that a lot of Italian products were. They decided to not put tariffs on Italian wine, but a whole series of other Italian products were. So theoretically, if they really wanted to, because Italy was a part of that award, so if they really wanted to, Italian wine could certainly be at risk for the Airbus issue.
Okay.
Now, the other two sort of buckets of risk on the tariff front right now are this broad universal tariff that President Trump has spoken about. It's unclear what the likelihood of that is, and it's unclear what it would look like. For instance, does that mean a 10% or a 20% tariff on every imported product coming into the United States? They've spoken that way before. At the same time, I'll remind everybody, during the first Trump administration, they also suggested there would be a 100% tariff on every import from Mexico, and that did not take place.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So a universal tariff is something that could potentially come into effect. To put it in long term, you likely need legislation to be passed through Congress, which is very difficult. The president doesn't really have the ability to put in a huge universal tariff long term without Congress. And so the minute you start getting Congress involved, you're going to have people asking questions, and there's going to be a lot of involvement around the potential, for instance, for exclusions of given products. Now, it's possible he could put in a universal tariff on everything for a short period of time, like let's say 180 days. There's like a national security exception that would allow that. It doesn't seem likely that he could use that same exception long term, particularly for things where it's not super clear that it's for a national security reason. I'll give you an example. They have used national security as a reason to immediately put in tariffs on steel and aluminum. And they'll say the U.S., needs these industries to help its military, capacity or whatnot.
Right.
And if we're not producing steel enough, we'll lose our ability to defend ourselves or something. If you put a giant universal tariff in place on every imported product, and included in there are stuffed bunnies from Vietnam, I'm not quite sure how long you could really have, a national security reason for putting a 20% tariff on a stuffed bunny that's manufactured in Vietnam.
And those only last 180 days anyway, correct?
I think so. Well, it looks that way. The other thing I'm just going to say is, look, there's a lot of uncertainty that's going to come.
Of course.
We have the way things have typically been done, but I think, it's reasonable to say that, during the Trump administration, we should expect a lot of uncertainty, and people are going to test a lot of boundaries. Maybe a more relevant example is the other big bucket of risk on the tariff world and on the wine world specifically will be around retaliatory tariffs. So, we had a retaliatory tariff around Airbus that was a part of a WTO award. Mm-hmm. But the U.S. has also done what they call Section 301 investigations on other trade practices that they deem to be unfair. And the U.S. will not again go to the WTO. They believe the WTO, that's the World Trade Organization, takes far too long to decide a matter. And really the governing body of the WTO and the arbitration process is not working right now anyway. There aren't enough arbiters and the U.S. won't appoint anyone. So you won't see anything go that path again, which means they would do a unilateral investigation, come up with an award value, and they could put tariffs in place where they see a discriminatory trade practice. Now, for wine, the first one that's important is around the digital services taxes. So
Okay.
digital services taxes are exactly what they sound like. They're taxes on digital services companies. They were sort of designed in an effort to get some revenue from these big internet companies that are generating revenue in a given country. So for example, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. France has put in a DST, a digital services tax of 3%. They have just potentially voted to increase it to 5%. But the US feels that it is discriminatory because there's a very high floor before the tax comes into place. So, for instance, in France, you need to be doing at least $750 million of revenue in order to be
Okay.
taxed. The US feels this is discriminatory because it means it mainly impacts these huge American businesses like Google, Apple.
Right. It's clear who they're going after in a sense with a tariff like that.
Exactly. So most of the French companies don't end up having to pay it. There had
Mm,
previously been, a proposal to put 100% tariff on sparkling wine from France
right.
as a part of this. Now, Italy has a DST. And this issue at the end of the Trump administration had sort of been punted, where there was, a quasi agreement that all of the countries that have DSTs in place would go before the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and they'd sit down and come to an agreement. What is a fair way to tax DSTs that doesn't discriminate against companies from any individual country? That
Okay.
agreement hasn't happened. So we expect to see DSTs, an action around DSTs pretty early in the Trump administration.
And a reminder for our listeners is digital service tax, correct, that you're referencing with the DST?
That's exactly
Okay.
right. These are these taxes on companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon.
Right. Okay. So you could see that would be a retaliatory tariff in response to a DST, is what we're,
Exactly.
we're thinking. Okay. And like you said earlier, and I'll repeat, so many unknowns. It's November 22nd. There's still plenty of time between now and when the new administration comes into office. So things will, I'm sure, no doubtedly be evolving over the next couple months.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Okay, so thanks, Ben, for laying the groundwork of where we're at today. I mean, from what you're saying, there's what's been done in the past, what we see potential, especially with the DSTs, and sounds like that's one of the hottest issues here, but still plenty of unknowns. But, if we're sitting here and working in the wine industry, let's talk a little bit about how potentially the tariffs could impact Italian wineries, in your opinion. And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but let's just, for argument's sake, say that something does happen, like how might it impact wineries in Italy?
Well, we can sort of look back to, the impact of the Airbus tariffs on French and Spanish wine for what we would foresee happening to Italian wine. I mean, in the instance that there was a large tariff, particularly, a 20 or 25% tariff that was placed on Italian wine, there's absolutely no doubt that you would see Italian wine exports to the United States drop significantly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have it exactly the percentage that French wine exports drop, but it would be a healthy hit to the market. We understand obviously that these products are not fungible. There's not really a substitute for Italian wines, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, you'd see fewer purchases from the United States. So I mean, that's something people have to take into consideration. Particularly, the other interesting piece here is, the U.S. wine market, as has really been struggling with, consumers have not wanted to absorb these higher prices.
Right.
And we've seen a lot higher prices in a whole series of different wines. And I don't think that there is a restaurant or a retailer in the US who hasn't had a lot of negative feedback around that from customers.
Yeah.
So, the potential for another hit that would cause prices to go up is, pretty concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with everything is quite price sensitive these days, from wine to milk and eggs and butter, right? And like you said, the industry's already taking a hit off recent rising prices. So it's definitely something that's on everyone's mind. How about for importers that are importing Italian wine, European wine in general? How should they be thinking about what could happen with the tariffs and preparing for next year?
Well, my honest, strong advice would be if you're an importer of wine and coming to the United States, reach out to the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance.
Mm.
We do a lot of work around this issue. Unfortunately, we are the primary organization working around tariffs. Most of the other large advocacy organizations simply don't have the time to do it. But importers that really know their products and moreover know their customers can be a
Mm-hmm.
real value add. One of the very best ways that we fight tariffs is by showing members of Congress and members of the Commerce Department and the U.S. Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, showing them how important these products are to small U.S. businesses around the country.
Mm-hmm.
And while they might not specifically be that concerned about whether or not an importer takes a hit, sort of by definition, you understand, gosh, if you import a given product, you're going to kind of take a hit if there's a tariff on it. When you can show that there's loads of small businesses in effectively every congressional district in the country that need these products and depend on them, then you really have a story to tell. And so if you're an importer, obviously it's a great idea in general to know who your customers are and to have good relationships with the restaurants and retailers that buy your wines. But it's more important now than ever, maybe, because if you can help reach out to those folks and, for instance, connect us at U.S. Wine Trade Alliance to the restaurants that are particularly good and care about these products in particular markets, you can really tell a story that people in Congress absolutely care about.
Right. Yeah, and that leads me to my next question, Ben, which was going to be, what are the primary ways in which the USA Wine Trade Alliance, under your leadership, is reacting to this news, and what are some of the tactics and things that you all are doing as an organization?
Well, our real goal is to tell the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
The whole point of a tariff is, or particularly these retaliatory tariffs, is to try to convince a target country to change behavior. For instance, if you believe there's an unfair trade practice going in, you're going to put a tariff in place that will convince that country to change that behavior.
Right.
The other piece here, obviously, that some people talk about is, helping your own, domestic producers. The good news is in the United States, the domestic wine growers, they really understand that tariffs on imported wine don't help them. Because of the 3-tier system, everybody needs healthy wine distributors in order to supply restaurants and retailers. And so domestic growers, they really rely on distributors for access to market. And so when you have a really unhealthy wine distributor, which can happen if you get hit with huge tariff bills, their capacity to bring on new domestic growers is really hit. So luckily, all of the big domestic grower organizations, from Wine America to the Wine Institute to the Napa Valley Vintners, they all tell folks in Congress that they're against tariffs on imported wine. And I do also believe that the fungibility piece, the question of whether one product is an actual substitute for another, is getting to be a lot more understood. Barolo is not Napa Valley Cabernet. Champagne is not sparkling wine from California. It's just not. They're different products. They have different customers. Different businesses depend on them. And so it's really not a proper substitute. I mean, almost by definition, like if you have a preference, there's not a substitute. I'll give you the inverse where it is truly fungible and you do not care. Have you ever looked or cared where the aluminum foil you buy is manufactured? No.
Nope.
Never. So you put a tariff on aluminum coming in from other countries. It makes it more expensive. They start manufacturing aluminum foil from, more American sources of aluminum. Do you care? No. You have no preference whatsoever. But people have strong preferences on wine. It's really a different product. And, I think everybody on this podcast probably understands that kind of implicitly. Sometimes what you want is, a great red wine from Italy. Sometimes what you want is a Napa Valley Cabernet. Sometimes you want something sparkling from France. That's the way it is. And luckily, I do think that argument that people in DC are really starting to understand that a lot more now.
Yeah. That tariffs on European wine don't equate to increased consumption and sale of U.S. wine. That's what we're understanding, or what Congress is trying to understand.
Exactly right. And the businesses that rely on these wines, if you really rely on, Chianti, there's not a substitute here in the U.S. So if you put a huge tariff on it, the only thing that happens is the U.S. businesses that depend on them, and again, I'm not just talking about importers and distributors, I'm really talking about restaurants. Restaurants are everywhere. They're the star businesses in, even small communities in every single state. There's no other option for them. So they just end up taking a hit to their profits, and they really can't afford to. Restaurants are a very, very low margin business. They're losing money on the food. They really sort of require at least one area of their business that they can make outsized margins. And I think people are sort of starting to understand that. But so what we at the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance do is we make sure that folks all over the United States, particularly influential folks around trade, are able to have those conversations with those local businesses to understand why it's important. And again, the point is not for me to tell them, hey, let me show you why you shouldn't put tariffs on wine. We want their own constituent businesses to say that message.
Right.
They do a great job. And so we connect with local businesses from, Tulsa, Oklahoma, to Abilene, Texas, to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to Tampa, Florida. And those constituent local businesses telling their story can have a huge impact.
Right. So the restaurants and retailers really advocating for themselves and how this will impact their business and their bottom line after, undoubtedly a very difficult for almost 5 years with COVID and everything else, rising cost of food and everything else that restaurants have been facing.
Absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. So really starting almost at the end of the line of where these tariffs will impact and working our way up in a way, if we think about strategy, like let's start with who this is going to impact at the front line with the consumer first, and then, work ourselves backwards to how that then relates to our distributors, importers, and our suppliers.
Right. I mean, the folks that are going to make decisions about this stuff, the list is crafted, a retaliatory trade list is crafted in the Commerce Department. And it's sort of approved and implemented by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. But all of those folks also listen to, influential members of Congress, particularly members of Ways and Means on the House side or Senate Finance on the Senate side. So connecting particularly with U.S. small businesses is really important. Unfortunately, I don't know that, one argument that people sort of used, I saw, written a lot in letters in the first go round was, the negative impact of consumer choice. And I don't know that people really care. And what I mean when I say people, I mean, I don't know that the people who craft the list necessarily care about that. Like if we're saying that right now you have 5,000 SKUs and you're going to go down to 3,000 SKUs, I don't know that they think that that's a big problem. But hearing how small businesses particularly care and depend on these products, that makes a real difference. We make sure that we have all the conversations with the right people, both in Commerce and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. That stuff is very important. It's really critical that they understand why wine is a poor remedy to relieve unfair trade practices overseas and why it disproportionately damages small U.S. businesses. But it's also important that those guys hear the confirmation from all of the members of Congress that they value. It works really well, or we think sort of the best recipe for success here is to have high-level conversations with the deciders, as it may be, in DC, and to make sure that they hear all of these confirming stories from all of the members of Congress that they care about, that they've heard from their own small businesses in their backyard. Basically, we need to make sure that when they think about a tariff on wine, the face that they're thinking of when they're thinking who's going to get hurt, we don't need them thinking about, a French champagne producer.
Right. Yeah.
Because they do not care. They absolutely do not care about that. We need to change the image of who gets hurt to that small local business and, the restaurateurs, around the country and the people who depend on these products.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And thank you for kind of explaining that clearly, Ben, and reiterating that point. So as we wind down on today's episode, what's next? How does everyone involved, from the restaurants and the retailers, the importers to the wineries, sitting overseas in Europe, prepare? Is there anything they can be doing? Is it more of a sit and wait? Or are there some things that you think that European-based wineries should be looking into right now as we prepare for next year?
It's a great question. Right now, I don't think panic does anybody any good. In the United States, we're preparing the best we can to tell the stories we can. You're going to hear, sort of spaghetti at the wall information.
Yeah.
There are going to be things you hear that may or may not come to pass. I'll use the example again of at one point it was suggested there would be 100% tariff on every product from Mexico.
Right.
So if you hear something, take a deep breath. Know it's going to get handled step by step. We've got to wait to see how things flesh out. We're still waiting to see who's going to be the U.S. trade representative. Obviously, we've heard the nominee for commerce, Howard Lutnick, who is the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. So we'll wait to see how those sorts of things play out. We're, again, pretty far away from understanding what's going to happen on this broad universal tariff risk. It could be, a range of options from it does not happen at all through there is a tariff on almost every imported product, but there are exclusions. We just really don't know. So we really are in a bit of a wait and see right now.
Okay. So just, I guess, read up, stay informed, listen to the news, follow along with, imagine everything you're doing, Ben, with USA Wine Trade Alliance. And like you said earlier, if you are a U.S. importer and you want to get involved, reach out and do your best to be patient. It sounds like is what we can recommend for the time being.
That's absolutely right. I mean, look, tariffs are certain. There is no doubt that the US is going to put tariffs on a whole swath of products.
Mm-hmm.
Tariffs on wine are absolutely not certain. It could happen,
Mm-hmm.
but it is not certain. We do have a stronger case than most imported products because of the way the three-tier system works and because we actually can point to small businesses all over the United States who depend on these products in a way that loads of other options that USTR will have from all over Europe, those businesses aren't going to have the story to tell that we do. I mean, the very fact that there are so many people in the United States concerned about tariffs on imported wines sort of points to that. We simply have more employees around the country who make their living selling these products. And that makes our position stronger than a lot of the other options that they're going to have.
Right.
Effectively, USTR is going to go to the mall of, European exports. And it's an amazing mall. There's French and Italian luxury products. There's meats and cheeses and oils and airplanes and security services and technology companies. And there's wine and there's fashion houses and cosmetics. And they're going to say, what is the most impactful thing we can put a tariff on to remedy problematic trade behavior? And don't get me wrong, the US absolutely believes EU is a bad trading partner. They just do. They believe that the European Union puts up trade barriers for huge numbers of, American products. US agriculture is a really good example. So they're going to try to correct, in their mind, some of this problematic trade behavior. But wine is the worst possible option here because it does more damage to US businesses than it does to businesses abroad, and because it's really unlikely to bring about change overseas by putting a tariff on imported wine.
Right, absolutely. And I think that last part you said about it does more damage to U.S. businesses and restaurants and retailers specifically than it does overseas is really key, and continuing to reinforce that message to Congress, but also, as importers, for those of us listening, working with our partners here locally in the U.S. as well. So that makes a lot of sense. But Ben, you've offered so much great insight today. Thank you so much for sharing all this information with us and joining me on the podcast. As we wind down, we'll do our rapid fire quiz that we do at the end of every episode. If you can do your best to answer these questions in just a couple sentences, that'd be great. So
I'll do my best.
Number one, what is your number one tip for mastering the U.S. wine market?
Know your customers. I'd say the number one tip for mastering any market, know your customers, know what they value, and know how your product is particularly important to them and can be differentiated from others.
Absolutely. Great advice. Number two, what is something you might have told your younger professional self about selling wine as you were getting into the industry in New York City?
You're very lucky. I feel like I sort of lucked into being a part of this, extraordinary industry. The idea that you actually get to participate in the wine world in a hobby that you love and you get to make a living at it, it's pretty lucky. So, I'd say, hold on and enjoy the ride.
I love that advice. Yeah. That's really great, I think, and a good reminder to all of us when we are in these uncertain times in our industry is we are still very lucky for what we do.
Absolutely, we
And
are.
finally, number 3, as you just said, we're very lucky because we often get to travel overseas and get into vineyards and drink great wines. What is your number one or one of your favorite travel hacks when you're out there traveling for work?
Oh, well, you know the answer to this. You go to the restaurants that the wineries go to. Ask a
Mm.
winemaker where to eat and drink, and you will never be disappointed.
Oh, that's a good one. Absolutely. All right, Ben. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Masterclass US Wine Market on the Italian Wine Podcast. How can our listeners connect with you and the USA Wine Trade Alliance?
You're welcome to email me at ben@tribecawine.com. You can certainly connect with you, Juliana, and you can forward any contacts to us. And if you're an importer, you can go to winetradealliance.org. Please do sign up. We'd love to hear from you. And I just remind everybody, tariffs on wine are not certain. You have a great story to tell. We can help you tell it. Hope to hear from you soon.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Ben. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me today. Stay tuned each week for new episodes of Masterclass US Wine Market with me, Juliana Colangelo. And remember, if you've enjoyed today's show, hit the like and follow buttons wherever you get your podcasts.